How'd you end up here? Why'd you even move here? Planning on staying here? Those are just some variations of questions that I've been routinely asked in almost every new conversation since I first moved to Youngstown, Ohio. As harmless and as well-meaning as those questions might have been, there was only one thing I could think of asking in return. What exactly is wrong with here? I come from a long line of movers. Every once in a while, we are shakers. Mostly we're just movers. So when I moved here to the Midwest about 20 years ago as a student at Youngstown State, newly married to a strapping young man of Italian descent, guess what? I thought I was going to fit in easily. Well, that determination was certainly challenged as soon as I started to integrate into Midwestern society. What I didn't know about Midwestern America is that it is the most rooted region in this country. And by using the word rooted in this instance, I mean that nearly half of the adult residents here have lived in the same community for most of their entire lives. What I also didn't know is that I had moved more or less into the heart of America's so-called Rust Belt, a part of the country that had earned this misnomer because it was once a thriving industrial sector which had given way to economic decline, decay, and depopulation. I apparently didn't get that memo. It didn't matter that Midwestern history and current reality were actually a much bigger story, anchored in great ideals, a skilled workforce, education, and healthcare. That industry here was much more diverse than just farms and factories. That the richness and resiliency of the people living here exceeded anything that was routinely portrayed about them. It didn't matter because a broken narrative of shame associated with the Rust Belt had taken hold. It felt like someone had put this fractured part of history on a repetitive loop, and you couldn't get away from it if your life depended on it. I mean, it was bad enough that outsiders who didn't even live here spoke about it regularly in news stories and top 10 listings of the worst places to live and raise your families and on and on. What really made it worse was that the people who lived here helped perpetuate this rundown in churches and in bars alike. How do I know? I had made it a habit to regularly attend both. So it had now morphed into a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it became the first soil that newcomers to this region had to work through as they began to plant themselves here. Broken narratives are repaired at the roots of what we believe. A broken narrative is an interesting term. It can be found in literature, in psychology, in sociology. In literature, it's sometimes called a fractured narrative, and it occurs because the storyteller has decided to take a short detour to add a side story or a pocket of information to the plot. In psychology, it might look like the effect of an illness or a really major traumatic event that has occurred. In sociology, it might look like a job loss, a move, a divorce, or even a natural disaster. Basically, a turn of events affecting a larger story. Yours, mine, a town's story, or even a nation's history. Whatever the setting, almost every single one of us can identify with an interruption that emerges at some point or another in our lives and needs to be addressed. However, if this interruption is lived out repeatedly and spoken about negatively long after it has occurred, it can become our identity and our reality, serving no purpose in forward momentum. Regardless of where the brokenness comes from, redemption and repair are possible because of roots firmly planted in ideals and beliefs that need to be somewhat more evolved than simply believing in yourself. I had great reasons for moving here, big, valid reasons like love, education, and career. But soon I began asking myself the same questions asked of me. Why did we even move here? And more importantly, why are we even choosing to stay? Well, for starters, I think it's a pretty well-established fact by now that you can't just move back and forth between countries, especially if you look like me. You also don't change jobs or universities on a whim. So we stayed, but we kept our walls up and engaged minimally and superficially in the community around us, and without even realizing it, started believing the broken narrative about the Midwestern Rust Belt. Could we have tried to plant ourselves among the Italians and the Indians who were already living here? Maybe. But let's face it, my husband would have never succeeded in getting me excited about playing bocce any more than I would have succeeded in getting him to dance to the latest Bollywood tunes. In a far more utopian world, bocce meets Bollywood would be a great reality show. Or maybe even a great TED Talk. But it just wasn't our story. We needed people who knew us enough to not believe us when we looked them in the eye and said, "We're fine," when fine was just about the last thing that we were. Were we successful here? Yeah, absolutely. From a very materialistic perspective, while living large and lonely in abject poverty when it came to real relationships with real people in real time. Haven't you all had times when you needed those people? The ones who know how to look past your infamous, "I'm fine," and show up at your door with a simple meal and a hug anyway? I did. There were many such times. But the pivotal moment came when I found myself home alone with my firstborn, knowing that it takes a village to raise a child, and now also knowing that I had no such village to speak of. As a young family, we realized two things very quickly. A new baby heralds the beginning of a brand new story, and that community is vital. How we chose to anchor our story within this community was going to matter in a very fundamental way, not just for us, but for our children, and for the perspective from which they would then view their hometown and the world. So how did we do this? We started at the most obvious place most of us tend to overlook anytime we're out trying to fix or repair anything: ourselves. We took to heart that old proverb that says that death and life are in the power of your tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. Knowing that led us to simply be more conscientious about how we spoke about this town, not just in front of our children, but also when they weren't around. Rather than focusing on the negatives, we chose to focus on the good. And once we started doing that, we realized that there was a lot of good to focus on. We slowly widened our horizons beyond our 2 cats and our 2 kids, and intentionally engaged other humans, starting with our neighbors. How's that for an idea that illuminates? Ask a neighbor over for a meal, and it doesn't matter if you just order a pizza. In fact, I hear there's a rumor around here that the pizza's pretty good. We also threw some pretty ridiculous house parties, which occasionally turned into even more ridiculous dance parties, where we invited just about everyone we knew, even people who we knew would hate each other's guts. a lot of people never showed up. Some people showed up and never spoke to us again. But a few others showed up, had a blast, started throwing their own parties, and have not stopped inviting us back. The catalyst, however, that finally triggered the repair of this damaged narrative at a very grassroots level in our lives was the investment we decided to make in the lives of others through local nonprofit organizations. That changed everything for us. So if you have no idea where to start, and if simply breaking bread and dancing with your friends, families, and neighbors does not appeal to you on any level, then my suggestion is that you start very simply by serving as a volunteer with a local nonprofit. What we invest in them is typically trivial in comparison to what we gain in return. But in doing these things, our perspective of the Midwestern Rust Belt finally changed. We started to attract the same vibrant, open, and beautiful relationships that we hoped we would have. Our family grew richer in ways that you could never put a monetary value on. Richer in local relationships that made us feel like we were finally home. Not just at home with ourselves, not just at home in a physical location kind of way, but more at home with ourselves and more grounded than we've ever been. So, what's your here? And have you been telling yourself that you're stuck here? Most of us who live here have either heard of or have experienced an interruption known as Black Monday, where thousands of steelworkers lost their jobs on September 19, 1977. It was devastating. And this valley walked into a wilderness. An entire generation has died in that wilderness, circling a metaphorical mountain of the Midwestern Rust Belt. And so, it is time to stand up and finally declare that there is nothing wrong with here. There's nothing wrong with here, and move on beyond this broken narrative. Let's move on by building on this completely upside-down philosophy that we can find life not only when we speak life, but when we give our lives away in the interest of one another. In doing that, we could all start living out stories of hope, redemption, and grace, written in the pages of a book with a far better narrative. The better story is still being written, and the ending is yet to come. And do you know what the best part is? The best part is that it might just look like a party in my father's house, with a table spread out for us, not only in this wilderness, but in spite of it. A table to which every last one of us has an open invitation. Thank you.